Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jessica Laird, and I'm going to be moderating today's panel. I'm an associate with the law firm of Munger, Olson in Los Angeles. Before we get started, I would just like to remind everyone that none of the comments made in today's panel reflect the views of the 5 co-hosting organizations or the California Lawyers Association. So we'd like to welcome you to Lawyers Across the Globe and Around the Clock for the Rule of Law, an unprecedented Rule of Law 24-hour webathon. This panel, presented by Union Internationale des Avocats and the California Lawyers Association, is titled Promoting a Gendered Approach to Economic Development and the Rule of Law. And our speakers will discuss the intersection between the rule of law and women's economic and social development. We are one of 12 different panels being offered for 24 continuous hours by bar associations worldwide to celebrate, address challenges to, and defend the rule of law, all on this YouTube channel. The rule of law is society's legal underpinning, guaranteeing human rights and creating economic opportunity and development. And members of the legal community are often the first line of defense. The rule of law is not merely the stock and trade of lawyers, but it is our core value. As such, we are proud to be part of this first of its kind webathon. I'm also particularly excited to be a part of this panel. The world is facing unprecedented economic, social, and democratic challenges, many of them exacerbated by the pandemic. One impact of these disruptions is that they have worsened existing gender inequalities around the world. Evidence shows that by placing women at the center of the rule of law and development agenda, societies can increase efficiency in the management of their institutions and resources, which in turn engenders better governance and greater economic security. This panel will discuss the relationship between addressing gender inequities and protecting the rule of law. Each of our 4 speakers that you see on the screen, Harumi Hata, Oyango Snell, Pauline Wright, and Schildhaus, will explore how different barriers to women's economic success can affect broader aspects of economic and political stability and the rule of law. We will then come together for a discussion surrounding the various issues that intersect within this topic. So first, I would like to introduce Harumi Hata. Ms. Hata was born in Kyoto, Japan, and grew up in Japan and the United States. Today, she is a shareholder of Buchalter, a full-service business law firm in the United States, and she is a member of Buchalter's Corporate Practice Group and Japan Practice Group. She represents clients, including companies based in the US, Europe, Asia, and Asia Pacific Rim, on corporate, business, and transactional matters, including mergers and acquisitions. Ms. Hata serves many of her clients as outside general counsel. In addition to her law practice, she is the president-elect of the Board of Governors of the Japanese American Bar Association, a council leader with US-Japan Council, and she serves on the Board of Advisors of the World Trade Center, Los Angeles. Ms. Hata also previously served as chair of the Executive Committee of Los Angeles County Bar Association's Business Law Section. So at this time, Harumi's going to go ahead and take the floor, and we welcome your remarks.
Thank you very much, Ms. Laird, and many thanks to all of you for joining us. It is my pleasure to be a part of this wonderful presentation throughout the 24-hour process. So thank you very much for including me. As Ms. Laird mentioned, the rule of law, it is a very important aspect of the society in which we live. It is a need for well-established and well-defined law to be consistently applied and fairly applied for the protection and promotion of those we live with, including women. So today's topic is with respect to the gender equality with a focus on women and those who identify themselves as women. I am located in Los Angeles, California, and many of my examples are generally based upon what is available in the areas in which I practice law and reside. The laws that are designed intended to serve and promote individuals, including women, intersect with governmental, quasi-governmental, and non-governmental organizations. And those organizations help promote and advance rule of law for individuals, including women. As you know, different branches of government, legislative, executive, and judicial branches intersect and hopefully complement one another in serving the citizens, including women. And so I would like to give references and examples in my speaking time to show examples of how placing women at the center of rule of law would help serve and improve economic, business, and financial conditions of everyone, including women. And so first, please allow me to discuss with respect to the governmental and agencies from the national, federal level, state level, and local level, as well as foreign. There are laws that are intended to protect individuals' rights, including women. As you know, in the United States, there are federal laws and federal labor laws, as well as state-specific laws, including state labor and employment laws. In California, in addition to the labor laws and other laws that are intended to help and serve the citizens of the state, there are corporations code sections that are intended to bring in more women into the service on the board of directors of publicly held companies. An example of this is the California Corporations Code section 301.3 that are intended to increase the service and representation of women on the various public boards. There are similar requirements such as this to promote the service and representation of minority individuals in service on the board of directors. On the side of promoting the national business economies, there are various programs that are presented by the federal government, including a program called Select USA. It's a US government program led by the US Department of Commerce, facilitating job creating business environment into the United States and raising awareness of the critical role that economic development plays in the US economy. As you know, the nation's vice president is a woman, Kamala Harris, who is the former United States Senator representing California for several years. And then prior to that, Vice President Harris was the California Attorney General for a number of years. Going back to California once again, California, if it is a sovereign nation, it would be ranked the 5th largest economy in the world. That is, as of 2021. That would be behind US, China, Japan, and Germany. Governor's office is very much involved in the promotion of business and economy in the state. Currently, the lieutenant governor is a woman by the name of Eleni Kounalakis. She's been serving as the lieutenant governor of the state of California since January of 2019. As with the governor, the lieutenant governor is very much involved in the promotion of businesses and promotion of women and minorities in the business sector and the financial sector in this state. As part of this, California has a program called California Go Biz. It is intended to serve as the state's leader for job growth, economic development, and business assistance to those coming into the state and those who are in the state. There are a number of women represented in running and being a part of this California's governmental agency. Ms. Dee Dee Myers, she's the senior advisor and director. She's the former White House press secretary under President Bill Clinton. The deputy director of international affairs and trade is a woman by the name of Ms. Emily Desai. There is also a trade and investment representative for Asia, and her name is Ms. Henan Lee. By way of an example, and this is an example of how involving women really help grow and nurture a healthy economic and financial and business sector. And going to the Los Angeles County, the Los Angeles County has a board of supervisors. It is a 5-member board. It's the government body of the California's County of Los Angeles. The board was created by the state legislature in 1852, so it's been around for quite some time. It has an annual budget of over $36 billion. Currently, all of the board members are women, with Ms. Helida Solis, Ms. Holly Mitchell, Ms. Sheila Kuhl, Ms. Janice Hahn, and Ms. Catherine Berger. And they're very much involved in the day-to-day operation of the County of Los Angeles. On the quasi-governmental agency side, in the Los Angeles County, there is the Los Angeles Economic Development Corporation, LAEDC for short. It is a non-profit public benefit organization founded in 1981 to collaborate with the County of Los Angeles to guide economic development and create more widely shared prosperity, promoting education, business, and government. And there is also an affiliated organization called the World Trade Center Los Angeles, WTCLA, which is also a non-profit public benefit corporation to attract foreign direct investment to the Los Angeles region and to facilitate business opportunities between Los Angeles and international companies. And it also sponsors and presents Select LA Investment Summit on an annual basis. Turning to the city of Los Angeles, there is Ms. Christine Peterson, who is the Deputy Director of International Trade and Investment as part of the Mayor's Office for the City of Los Angeles. Looking beyond the state of California, just by way of an example, on the foreign side, the foreign government side, there are examples of governmental agencies from foreign governments that are involved in promoting business, including promoting business by women. One example is Japan External Trade Organization, JETRO for short. It was established in 1958, and currently it has 51 offices in Japan and over 75 offices outside of Japan, according to their website, to promote trade and investment between Japan and the rest of the world. There's also, out of Singapore, an Enterprise Singapore. It's a Singaporean governmental agency that is intended to promote competitive Singaporean enterprises and creating good jobs for Singaporeans. On the foreign side, there are many consulates general posted in the United States and in other countries. In Los Angeles, by way of an example, there are over 60 consulates general, and in addition, about 40 honorary consulates. Many of the consular offices are active in promoting cooperation and collaboration to benefit the country and the citizens of the country that they represent. And promoting women is part of many of the consulates general's mission for themselves and in the countries in which they serve. On the global side, there are organizations such as the World Bank, including having gender equality for development initiatives to provide a wide array of financial products and technical assistance, including in order to promote gender equality in the labor market. there is an example project through the World Bank, which is the Impact Evaluation to Development Impact, I2I, which is the World Bank's multi-donor trust fund program to assist with developmental policies in countries to address jobs for resilience, public sector governance, urban crime and violence, and gender-based violence. There is also an International Monetary Fund, IMF. There are various research and policy projects intended to help with the promotion of gender balance in the financial sector and labor force. More on the business side, there are companies that have various social responsibility policies, diversity policies, and other policies designed to require and promote equality and inclusion. An example of implementing the various policies, such as the social responsibility policies, diversity policies, and other policies, would be a requirement as part of the company's solicitation of business proposals, RFPs, requests for proposal process, that require the inclusion of various diverse individuals, including women and minorities, not only as part of the RFP process itself, but also to actually have the individuals from different diversity backgrounds, including women, to be actively involved and engaged in the delivery of services and products to companies and to as part of the promotional endeavors. And aside from these various sort of examples of how at different levels there are organizations, including public organizations, governmental organizations, and private organizations that exist to promoting the advancement of women in the labor force, in the business sector, and in the financial sector. So thank you very much for including me. And now I turn the program back to Ms. Laird.
Thank you very much, Harumi. So next we're going to hear from Oyango Snell. Mr. Snell is the Chief Executive Officer and Executive Director of the California Lawyers Association and the California Lawyers Foundation. Prior to his current role, he served as Senior Vice President, General Counsel, and Corporate Secretary for the Western States Petroleum Association, where he was responsible for antitrust compliance, environmental and climate policies, and corporate governance matters. Among his many achievements at the WSPA, Mr. Snell created a first-in-class in-house legal advocacy and human resources program, provided legal advocacy for monumental climate policy initiatives to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and created a leadership initiative for women in the oil and natural gas industry. As a servant leader, Mr. Snell volunteers his time and support as the chair of the board of directors for the local United Way, all while finding time to be an active, engaged father of 2 boys with his wife, Shauna. Oyango, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Much appreciated. And thank you to Harumi for kicking off this very important conversation. So I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach and give you a little bit of background. You know, at the center of my personal and professional development, there have been very strong women from different walks of life that have helped shape and frame my growth, both as a servant leader and as a father of my 2 boys, and as a husband, as you mentioned, Jessica. Now, from my single mom who dropped out of high school to raise 3 kids, to my Jewish single parent foster mom who took in my sister and I when my mom couldn't handle the economic hardship anymore that she had suffered from. From a teacher, Greta Chamberlain, who had placed me in charge of the 6th grade debate team and was the first person that actually told me that I could become an attorney. To Dr. Lois Pelakudis, my political science and academic advisor in undergraduate school, who pushed me to learn how and to enhance my writing if I wanted to become a lawyer. She would always tell me that. From the many women leaders in politics, in the legal field, and in the social services community in Columbus, Ohio, that mentored me and helped me to grow and develop, to the millions of lives of others that women have impacted and enhanced from a leadership and economic perspective, I contend to you that the very profession that I have come to love, that is the legal profession, in many regards, should and must do more to protect and enhance women in our society. Now, allow me to paint a few pictures for you to ponder. So first, within my initial 60 days into the role of CEO and Executive Director of the California Lawyers Association, I took a deliberate approach to ensuring that our staff received a cost of living adjustment. And as I began combing through my personnel costs, I began to look at the variance between like positions. As you probably can imagine, I found some pay discrepancies. One particularly caught my eye because it was about a $24,000 difference between two employees who were hired to do the exact same job. The only difference is one was a male and one was a female. So I asked you, who do you think was getting the short end of the stick of that 24K? Now, as a newly minted CEO, I found this pay discrepancy to be unacceptable, even though there was no intentional malice or discrimination. In fact, in many cases, the discriminatory act may be unintentional. And to me, there lies the actual danger that plagues our society when it comes to pay equity and ensuring that women's rights are protected. The second kind of vignette or thing that I want to share with you is looking back as a kid and growing up on the South Side of Chicago. I recall my mom taking odd jobs here and there to try to keep a roof over our head and food on the table for me and my siblings. But what struck me as a kid was that every time the police would visit our apartment after my mom and her boyfriend got into a physical altercation, nothing happened. They took a report and that was it. Now, third and lastly, as far as these three things that I want you to ponder on, and fast forwarding many, many years later, a female friend of mine got into some legal trouble. And when she held firm and didn't cooperate with authorities by making the deal, things went very bad for her very, very quick. Now, it was her first offense and criminal intent was lacking for the alleged crimes. But instead of a slap on the wrist, like most males in similar situations facing similar allegations would have received, a harsh sentence was handed down by the judge. And as you can probably imagine, the judge happened to be an elderly senior white male. So pay equity, domestic violence and abuse, and harsh punishment and sentencing are just three of the many issues that unfairly impact women and diminishes the economic power and positioning that those women possess in our society. Over the past 30 years in the US, more single women are head of households. The share of households headed by single women from 1990 to 2019 increased from approximately 18% to 23%. Even among married two-earner households, it is becoming increasingly common to see women as the head of the household. Among married households, the share of women heads of households increased 24 percentage points. So from 22% in 1990 to 46% in 2019. Also among married households, Black households had the highest share of women headed households at nearly 53%. So think about this for a minute. As wages continue to stay suppressed for women, despite the fact that they are now heads of households, economic power, educational attainment, housing, healthcare, and other important decisions that women leaders must make are also suppressed or limited by their economic means, albeit unfairly. Worldwide, women still only earn 77 cents for every dollar earned by men, and this inequality persists across all sectors and all countries. And as you can imagine, the gap widens even further for mothers, immigrants, and for women whose race or ethnicity makes them a minority in their country of residence. According to a Pew Research Center analysis of median hourly earnings of both full and part-time workers, women earned 84% of what men earned in the US in 2020. Now, based on this estimate, it would take an extra 42 days of work for women to earn what men made in 2020. And as you can imagine, these statistics have generally been much bleaker for women of color, with Black women earning 62 cents on the dollar, Hispanic women earning 54 cents on the dollar, Asian women earning more than the overall average at 89 cents on the dollar, Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander women earning 61 cents on the dollar, and American Indian or Alaskan Native women earning 57 cents on the dollar. Now, while you may think that the legal profession couldn't reveal such a significant gap in pay between men and women, I kindly ask you to think again. Women have made up roughly half the graduating law school classes over the past several years, but women are still a minority at high-level partner positions in firms and generally underrepresented in private practice altogether. The US Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that in 2019, women lawyers made on average $1,878 per week, whereas males made $2,202 per week. Now, this means that women made 85 cents on the dollar according to against their male counterparts, rather, or if you add that up, that's $16,848 less per year than their male counterparts. So we can ask each other, why does this pay gap still exist in the US? Why are women frequently at the bottom of the economic food chain for equal work when in 1963, the Equal Pay Act was passed by the US Congress, promising equitable wages for the same work, regardless of race, color, religion, national origin, or sex of the worker? Why is this the case in 1964? Title VII of the Civil Rights Act was passed by the US Congress to include a prohibition against employment discrimination on the basis of other things, including sex. As one former female president of the American Bar Association once told me, the law was created by men, particularly white men, for men, again, particularly white men. So when you really think about it, women and people of color came much later into the equation of the law, just within the last several decades. So the inequities that we see today are grounded in history of our established laws and policies that govern our very existence. And to that end, one would think that the rule of law should serve as a catalyst or vehicle to achieve equity, fairness, and a righting of the social and economic ill wills of the past. In 1994, the Violence Against Women Act developed funds for services for victims of rape and domestic violence. This act allows women to seek civil rights remedies for gender-related crimes and provides training to increase police and court official sensitivity and a national 24-hour hotline for battered women. Now, make no mistake about it. Domestic violence causes financial problems for survivors. It entraps them into poverty and into the abusive relationship in and of itself. And women in abusive relationships report instances where these toxic relationships obstruct their ability to find work, maintain employment, and use their wages to establish greater economic independence and safety. In fact, violence against women can have a multidimensional effect on the overall health of an economy, which makes this matter a national, albeit global issue, not just an individual household issue. Women are likely to work fewer hours and be less productive even when they do have work. High levels of domestic violence can decrease the number of women in the workforce altogether, minimize women's acquisition of skills and education, and result in less public investment overall as more public resources are channeled to health and legal services. Now, several years ago, a Thomas Reuters Foundation survey determined that the 5 most dangerous countries for women were Afghanistan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Pakistan, India, and Somalia. The survey was updated in 2018 to determine whether more was being done to address the overall risk faced by women regarding healthcare, access to economic resources, customary practices, sexual violence, non-sexual violence, and human trafficking. The poll was expanded to the 10 most dangerous countries, and that then included the United States, which came in 10th overall, but ranked joint 3rd with Syria when respondents were asked a pivotal question: whether women felt that they were most at risk of sexual violence, harassment, and coercion into sex, and 6 regarding non-sexual violence such as domestic and mental abuse. So let's get that. In the United States, a poll indicated that US ranks 10th as the most dangerous country for women overall, third where women risk sexual violence, harassment, and coercion into sex, and sixth in domestic violence and mental abuse. Now, according to the American Journal of Emergency Medicine, domestic violence cases increased by 25 to 33% globally in 2020, obviously one of those factors being the global health pandemic. The global health pandemic and its remnants revealed the dangers for women around the world. The Violence Against Women Act was actually reauthorized by the US Congress and signed into law by President Joe Biden. The act was extended to 2027, but it is not permanent law. It is an act. The bulk of domestic violence and abuse cases are addressed at the local and state court level. However, states vary in their domestic violence provisions, and only 38 states place domestic violence definitions and penalties within their criminal codes. So to that end, much more work needs to be done to address domestic violence and harassment, which impacts economic power, as well as standing and positioning from women within our society. The Me Too movement may not be marching on state capitals in Washington, D.C. as often as it once was, but the movement lives on and the rule of law will have a significant role to play. Now, while women often relate to criminal justice system as victims of crimes, recent trends indicate that a growing number of women are also featured as suspects, accused, and prisoners. In fact, the percentage of women in prison is growing globally and at a faster rate than the male population, according to a study conducted by the United Nations Entity for Gender Equality and the Empowerment of Women. Like the law itself, the criminal justice system has historically been designed by men for men. And to that end, laws and policies fail to take into account the pathways of mitigating female incarceration or imprisonment in and of itself. Access to justice, discriminatory criminalization, and accountability sentencing must be examined to promote the rights and the protections that are critical for women in conflict with and by the law. Now, lastly, turning to the legal profession itself and the very institutions that can help level the balance of power and economic status, forces us to examine the judiciary and supporting institutions that help make up the legal profession. Lawyers are required to self-police and protect the legal industry by exercising moral judgment, ensuring legal competence by its professionals, and demonstrating good ethical behavior to guard against even the slightest appearance of impropriety. Lawyers are engaged in every facet of our society, from creating the laws and regulations that we abide by in business, taxes, education, science, and entertainment, to interpreting and enforcing those laws and regulations. Court decisions at all levels impact policies, laws, regulations, and ultimately how consumers and businesses behave. Court decisions also enforce contracts, order financial penalties, make judgments about the constitutionality, fraud, liability, discrimination, antitrust, and so on. But people who do work for the judiciary aren't necessarily representative of its population. So although more women are actually working in the legal system than ever before, they are still outnumbered by men. According to a study published in 2020 by the American Bar Association, women represented 37% of lawyers in the United States, even though they make up nearly 51% of the US population. About 27% of all federal judges are women. And when you consider women of color, 60%, or 55 out of 91 of all Article III district federal courts have 0 women of color actively serving on the bench. Across the 13 appellate circuits, women make up about 1/3 of judgeships. That's 60 women and 115 men that are currently serving as judges. And of the 116 justices appointed to the US Supreme Court, 95% have been male, and that includes the recent appointment of Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. The rule of law represents the principle that all laws are developed and applied equally. The concept itself is designed to ensure that equity is applied in the application of the law to all, no matter privilege, gender, race, or status. The rule of law serves as the vehicle where civil liberties and protections are aligned with the legal process and equity. It serves as a balance to the historical, social ills plaguing our society and the rights, pursuits, and dreams of all of its people. The rule of law distributes power, economic standing, and position. Bar associations like the California Lawyers Association, the California Women Lawyers, and many other women leadership groups and allies must continue to bring gender inequalities to light and work to identify opportunities that may be addressed by the rule of law. The problem of female underrepresentation in the legal profession is significantly important to address. Lawyers are viewed as leaders and trusted gatekeepers of equity and fairness, and they instill in the rule of law to help to shape society's perception and views of the legal system. I will conclude with this. The rule of law has a significant role to play in charting an equitable future for women around the world, to mitigate poverty, to lessen the gender pay gap, to protect women from violence and abuse, to eliminate discriminatory criminalization, to lead our institutions to help form a more just society. And women must have a seat at the table to help lead the way in achieving these changes, not a seat in the rafters as policies governing their lives and the lives of those that they are in care of. In other words, I will quote the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg: "Women belong in all places where decisions are being made. It shouldn't be that women are the exception." And I will add, it should be the rule, not the exception, to be gender inclusive in all that we do. Thank you for having me. I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much for those remarks, Oyango. Now I'd like to introduce Pauline Wright. Ms. Wright is an accredited specialist in environmental planning and development law and partner of environmental planning law firm PJ Donnellan and Company on the New South Wales Central Coast. She is president of the New South Wales Council for Civil Liberties, only the second woman to have held that role, and a past vice president of New South Wales Women Lawyers. Ms. Wright is also a past president of both the Law Council of Australia and the Law Society of New South Wales. And she is the Australian representative on the board of the Union Internationale des Avocats. She is also a member of the executive committee of Lawasia and the co-chair of Lawasia's Human Rights Committee. Ms. Wright is also a keen ocean swimmer and has been active in surf lifesaving. She is president and co-founder of the Five Lands Walk, a unique collaboration between the First Nations and broader communities, creating an annual cultural and arts festival on the central coast of New South Wales, Australia, since 2006. And Pauline, you have the floor.
Thanks very much, Jessica. Yama, or greetings in language from Darkinjung country on the central coast of New South Wales, from where I'm joining you. And I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and acknowledge their youth, in whose hands is held our hope in Australia for a reconciled future. Barriers to women's economic success can affect broader aspects of economic and political instability, which in turn affect the operation of the rule of law, particularly access to justice. This is all the more so in the face of global crises, including climate change. I'm firstly going to just talk about the rule of law for a moment, because there are differing concepts as to what constitutes the rule of law. So it's helpful to begin by talking about what I mean when I use that term. The preamble to the UN Declaration of Human Rights says that it is essential, if man is not to be compelled to have recourse as a last resort to rebellion against tyranny and oppression, that human rights should be protected by the rule of law. The rule of law stands in contrast to the rule of laws. Observing the letter of the law is not enough to satisfy the rule of law. Where the rule of law applies, at least these key features may be observed: equality under the law, equal access to the law and legal remedies, transparency of law, and an independent judiciary. The laws themselves must be just and adhere to fundamental principles of human rights and civil liberties. We as lawyers have a duty to ensure that our governments enact and maintain just laws in accordance with the rule of law. Both local and international legal associations have an important role to play in upholding and improving the rule of law. So, what are the climate change and global threats to the rule of law for women? There's a broad scientific consensus that anthropomorphic factors are changing the global climate. The impacts are different regionally, and it appears that the greatest warming will occur at high latitudes during winter, whereas precipitation changes will be strongest in tropical regions. Some ocean regions are going to experience minimal temperature changes, and this may, however, change over time. But when addressing the impact of climate change, it's important for law and policymakers, and the global legal profession, no matter where we are on the globe, to bear in mind that the effects of climate change are not equitable from a gender perspective. To ensure that our responses to climate change are consistent with the key principles underpinning the rule of law, including equal access to justice and remedies, it's important to recognise that the effects of climate change, including heat waves, droughts, rising sea levels, and extreme storms, do disproportionately affect women. And that's because women and girls comprise the majority of the world's poor, and their abilities to adapt well to climate change are significantly constrained by their economic disadvantage. Inequality in economic advantage and power within a society are key factors leading to breakdown in the rule of law. So promoting equality helps the rule of law. 70% of the 1.3 billion people living in conditions of poverty are women. In urban areas, 40% of the poorest households are headed by women. Women predominate in the world's food production, 50 to 80%, but they own less than 10% of the land. Women are also more likely to have less access to basic human rights, like the ability to freely move and acquire land, and face systematic violence that escalates during periods of instability, including in climate crisis. Women have limited access to and control of environmental goods and services. They have negligible participation in decision-making in many areas of the globe, and they're not involved in the distribution of environment management benefits. And consequently, women are less able to confront climate change and its impacts. During extreme weather, such as droughts and floods, women tend to work more to secure household livelihoods. And this in turn leaves less time for women to access training and education, develop skills, or earn income. In Africa, female illiteracy rates were over 55% in 2000, compared to 41% for men. When coupled with inaccessibility to resources and decision-making processes, limited mobility places women where they are disproportionately affected by climate change. These factors and many more mean that as climate change intensifies, women will struggle the most. It's notable that the Paris Climate Agreement includes specific provisions to ensure women receive support to cope with the hazards of climate change. 3 main aggravating factors have been identified which exacerbate the unequal effects of climate change. Firstly, increase in the exposure of the disadvantaged groups to the adverse effects of climate change. Secondly, increase in their susceptibility to damage caused by climate change. And thirdly, decrease in their inability to cope and recover from the damage suffered. Inequality has been a persistent issue in the climate change discussion. In general, it's been part of the discussion on climate justice. However, the focus in this discussion has been mainly on inequality across countries rather than within countries, that is, community to community or gender to gender. On the one hand, there are inequalities based on demographic characteristics such as gender, but they also include race, ethnicity, religion, and age. Another kind of inequality is with respect to assets and income. A third type is in public decision-making or political power and access to public resources such as publicly financed health, education, housing, financing, and other services. And needless to say, these different types of inequalities are interrelated and affect women disproportionately to men. Inequality plays an important role in the choice or allocation of occupation and types of task performed. Apart from income and asset inequality, gender plays an important role. For example, rural women's lower asset positions, as well as land tenure arrangements and social restrictions, limit the land available to them. So this leads women farmers to work on more marginal land, which is in turn exposed to greater climate-related hazards. Also, social norms in many places require women to collect water and firewood, often compelling them to travel long distances, especially in times of drought, forcing them to confront additional hazard. Consequently, they face a greater exposure to the adverse effects of climate change. These effects result in higher workloads for women, occupational hazards, both indoors and outdoors, psychological and emotional stress, and higher mortality compared to men. So this exacerbates the already unequal status and entrenches poverty and disadvantage for women and their children. Another impact of climate change is forced migration. An average of 22.5 million people have been displaced by climate or weather-related events since 2008, translating to an estimated one person being displaced each second. Climate change has led to a scarcity of natural resources as well as sea level rise in many geographical locations, forcing whole populations to relocate. Crops and livestock are being increasingly at risk from floods, droughts, and bushfires due to climate change, and that worsens food security concerns. And there are notable differences in how various forms of forced migration affect males and females. Limited urban planning and design, inadequate land management, poor physical and social infrastructure, and the lack of equitable distribution of resources and policies are some of the reasons that disasters are much riskier for women than for men. The UN Refugee Agency states that competition over resources and jobs can generate animosity between forced migrants and host communities, which adds an additional layer of complexity. Women and their children arriving in new places with dwindling financial resources face potential descent into homelessness. Homeless women and their children are especially vulnerable because they lack the financial means to access basic services. Women, girls, and young boys are also more vulnerable to sexual violence when subjected to homelessness. Although the risk of sexual abuse is present in rural and urban settings, the public spaces in cities, for example, rail and bus stations, public toilets and parks, provide places and opportunities for sexual predators to harass women and children. And that's a phenomenon that is accordingly more prevalent in urban settings. Access to justice is particularly important for women and children in this context. Loss of community cohesion leads to a breakdown in the rule of law. Policies that enable economic independence of climate displaced people and which encourage community cohesion in times of disaster are essential. The experience is that connected communities will help and protect each other. In a groundbreaking article by Karen O'Brien and Robin Lechenko called Double Exposure, Assessing the Impact of Climate Change Within the Context of Economic Globalizations, the authors considered this issue on the eve of the Kyoto climate change negotiations in 2000. they said that despite widespread recognition that there'll be unequal impacts with both climate change and globalizations, the two issues are rarely examined together. And their paper looked at the simultaneous impact of climate change and globalization. They concluded that certain regions, sectors, ecosystems, and social groups will be confronted by both the impacts of climate change and by the consequences of globalization. There's a recognition that some areas are more vulnerable to climate change than others. Differential impacts superimposed on differing vulnerabilities have in turn resulted in a complex geography of climate change. And to add further complexity to the picture, climate change is taking place within a rapidly changing world. Ongoing processes of economic globalization are exacerbating existing vulnerabilities to climate change, which in turn means increased impact on women and their children. Examining the joint impacts of globalization and climate change may bring a better understanding of the future of world agriculture and other environmentally sensitive sectors. Double exposure to these two factors has important policy implications for those who are likely to experience the negative consequences of both globalization and climate change, including women. O'Brien and Lashenko posit that there may also be causal links between globalization and climate change. So in addition to the direct contributions of transnational corporations to greenhouse emissions, globalization may also exacerbate climate change by fostering more rapid development and consequently higher levels of fuel consumptions by consumers throughout the world. But conversely, policies intended to control greenhouse emissions may indirectly promote globalization as industries shift location to avoid enforcement of new emission standards in some of the more developed countries. Vulnerability to climate change may be biophysical or it may be social. And the former, of course, refers to the physical conditions of the landscape and how they impact humans or biological diversity, while the latter defines vulnerability according to the political, social, economic conditions of a society. And that's where gender comes in. Climate change has been increasingly recognized as one among many processes that influence vulnerability. But you should know that the most vulnerable people may not be in the most vulnerable places. People in poverty can live in productive biophysical environments and be vulnerable, and wealthy people can live in fragile physical environments and live relatively well. So assessments of vulnerability shouldn't be limited to developing countries or countries with precarious physical environments. Vulnerability to climate change is not exclusively related to poverty, of course. Extreme climate events can impact the wealthy and poor alike, particularly in high-risk environments. For instance, in Australia, we've experienced bushfires in desirable leafy locations and devastating storm surges in highly sought-after beachfront locations where people's homes are literally being washed into the sea. Although the wealthy are more resilient to recovery through mechanisms such as insurance, premiums in high-risk areas are becoming increasingly difficult to obtain. The recent flooding that's been experienced in Australia has shown this to be the case, especially in the Northern Rivers area of New South Wales. Between the 25th of February and the 2nd of March this year, 2022, there was a series of severe rain and flooding events impacting the east coast of Australia, stretching from the Sunshine Coast in southeast Queensland all the way to the south coast of New South Wales. And to put that into perspective, this is a stretch of coastline that takes more than 12 hours to travel by car at 100 kilometres per hour. Many people in the Northern Rivers of New South Wales and southeast Queensland are facing crippling insurance costs, meaning that whole towns have become uninsurable. The same applies to affected places from the bushfires in 2019-2020. That means that people have had their houses destroyed but can't rebuild them. Those who are least able to afford insurance are the most affected, and these, of course, include women. Residential caravan parks are a common form of affordable housing in Australia, And women and children living in poverty make up a large number of the demographic living in this form of accommodation, especially in coastal and regional areas susceptible to inundation and bushfire. The long-held theory has been that it should be possible to evacuate dwellings and caravan parks in a timely way prior to flooding or in the face of bushfires. But many of these have in fact evolved to be semi-permanent and fixed in place. And many caravan parks across the Northern Rivers suffered severe damage in the 2022 floods, again highlighting the vulnerability of caravan parks and their residents, many of them women, to flooding. But what was heartening was the degree of community leadership that was observed in many locations, with community recovery hubs established in informal locations such as community halls to assist communities with their immediate recovery needs. And these were often headed by women, and they were in addition to the formal government recovery mechanisms, but they were really effective in helping communities on the ground. So what's the future? It may be daunting, but it's not all bad news. Women are showing remarkable resilience around the world. They're leading climate action movements, championing clean sources of energy, and building alternative models of community that focus on sustainability and cooperation. Women's participation and leadership can have transformative effects in their countries and communities. And we need men, the whole community, to come on board to support action to facilitate their participation. Legislative responses for which the global legal profession can advocate should be targeted to access to safe, accessible, and affordable housing for forced migrants, effective climate change adaptation, disaster risk reduction. And all of these can alleviate some of the existing economic and social vulnerabilities that come with climate-related displacement. It should also be noted that the UN has found that when societies have higher levels of gender inequality, deforestation, air pollution, and resource loss get worse. So increasing gender equality should also be a priority for law and policymakers. As women gain more representation within decision-making bodies, countries are beginning to develop gender action plans that combine climate action with efforts to improve gender equality. So it may be possible to address two goals simultaneously: reduction of inequality and mitigation of climate change. The key here is inequality reduction, which can help to contain the adverse effects of climate change. And through the feedback effect, increased equality may mitigate climate change itself. So a virtuous cycle may replace the current vicious cycle. At the 26th UN Climate Change Conference of the parties, the COP20C, the UNHCR urged all parties to combat the growing and disproportionate impact of the climate emergency on the most vulnerable countries and communities, in particular those displaced and their hosts, and to support vulnerable countries and communities in their efforts to rapidly scale up prevention and preparedness measures to avert, minimize, and address displacement. The global legal profession can help by providing legal advice, guidance, and support to the international community to develop enhanced protection for refugees and other people displaced in the context of disasters and climate change, and catalyzing international discussions on their rights and on the urgent need to address inequality within societies. We can advocate for our governments to deliver on securing a global net zero, mobilize finance, and adapt to protect communities and natural habitats. Yalalu, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Pauline. Finally, I'd like to introduce Erin Schildhaus. Erin is a partner in the minority women-owned law firm Martorello, Schildhaus LLC. And Mr. Schildhaus is an international business lawyer with decades of experience representing businesses and NGOs in the US and worldwide. He is a recipient of numerous professional awards and recognitions, including the American Bar Association Mayor Rasmussen Award in recognition of his contributions to the advancement of women in international law. Since 2011, he has served as Vice President of Women Empowerment Network. Mr. Schildhaus has over a decade of global work experience, including 10 years in Paris, France, and 4 years in Buenos Aires, Argentina, from where he is currently joining us. He is a former member of the UIA Governing Board, is an honorary member of AIJA, was the chair of the ABA International Law Section in 2008, and is currently the ABA delegate to the Inter-American Bar Association. Aaron, the floor is yours.
Okay, I'm trying to put up this, oh, wrong one. Well, anyway, thanks very much. I'm trying to find the, here it is. Thank you. First of all, I wanted to mention that I like very much everything that has been said before me. I think that Harumi, Oyango, and Pauline all had really important things to say. And to a large extent, in light of that, I mean, I think many of us are preaching to the choir. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, for example, which I believe that a couple of you mentioned, is almost 75 years old. And the CEDAW, the Convention for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, and is something that's been, if you will, ignored, unfortunately, in the United States. And we do have a long way to go. And I have a lot of statistics here that I developed. For example, I wanted to make the point that the rule of law, as it's been mentioned, is not just the rule of law or the law of the rulers. And I think a couple of you mentioned that. But for a long time, we've tried to define the rule of law in a way that goes more than just what the written rule of the law is. Because the laws as written in many countries are in fact discriminatory against women, discriminatory against minorities, but women constitute the most important minority. And for that reason, today's discussion is critically important. To set the stage for the just rule of law, which I call the just rule of law, not just the rule of law, we have laws and regulations, but we also have the application of those laws. And in both cases, women are suffering a great deal. In the rule of law, in my view, as has earlier been mentioned, it requires equal treatment under the law. And equal treatment not only as applied, but also means that all people in society are treated equally. When it's not the case, the rule of law fails. One of the examples that I was asked to focus on was the aspect of corruption. Corruption damages women more than it damages men. Why? Because, as pointed out by some of my predecessor speakers, women are in a weaker position and already discriminated against in so many different dimensions of life that the net result is that they can't get out from under where they are, and they continue to get in a worse and worse position as time goes by. Notwithstanding all the arguments that have been made with respect to the COVID pandemic, the situation was there before the pandemic. There's been a bias against women that I don't have to repeat, and that's been focused on and mentioned by all of you already. How do we get beyond that? I was very tempted to throw away my whole slide presentation here, which probably would have made it a lot easier for me to speak, if you will. But because I'm not used to the technical mechanics. But one of the points that was made I think it was Pauline said, we need men to get on board. Well, Women Empowerment Network, which I'm involved with for many, many years, recognizes that. It's not just a group of women that are promoting women's rights. The important thing is to get men who are in control of many of the levers of power and responsible for the cultural bias that exists, to get them on board, to also recognize the damage that's been done and to take concrete steps to change that. Yes, we've already heard today about some of the laws that exist on the books, not just at the United Nations level, but locally, regionally, nationally. There's plenty of laws on the books. And how is it that women are still in such a negative position? These are some of the reasons: child marriage, early marriage, arranged marriages, the birth rates, which come from the lowest economic sectors of the society. Notwithstanding that, a UN Women report showed that the total fertility rate has decreased by almost half since the 70s, and that family size is declining in all regions. Yet, another point they made was that discriminatory family laws cause and reinforce gender inequalities in marriage and in the family, and that despite legislative progress, violence against women and girls still is incredibly persistent. Contraception, more than 3 or 4 married women between the ages of 15 and 49 used modern methods of contraception in 2015. So that's a factor, but it's not making any much of a change. The global labor force of women has declined slightly, and yet women continue to have unequal access to income and assets. I think one of the people earlier mentioned that women spend much more time doing unpaid care. 3 times as much time spent by women doing unpaid care and domestic work as men do, which consequently limits their opportunities to engage in paid work, get an education, or even enjoy free time. And as was also mentioned by Pauline, the migration issue is dominated by women. And people, if you look at the situation in Ukraine, for example, today, most of the people who are engaged in the forced migration and the voluntary migration to get away from the war zones are women and children. Obviously, because the men are back taking care of shooting other people and so on, but and protecting their homes. When women are treated as equals and are given greater opportunities to advance, the rule of law is stronger. So consequently, there's less corruption and a greater equality. We talk about corruption. Evidence shows that women perceive and experience corruption differently than men, and that women suffer corruption to a greater extent due to the unequal power relations between men and women. Corruption exacerbates these power dynamics, limiting women's access to public resources, information, and decision-making, thus reinforcing social, cultural, and political discrimination. The converse is true. Removing corruption is good for women and something that men have to get behind. Studies in governance show that women lag behind men in almost every country in the world. There are fewer women legislators, fewer women in the judicial institutions, fewer women in the executive leadership of countries, and fewer women in positions of power in the corporate, business, and financial world. There's a number of slides that I added to this that are not just a bunch of words, and perhaps I'll go right away to the first one here, which is a recent EU study by the Joint Research Center of the EU, which shows the employment rate of women and men in the EU. men represented by the blue lines and women represented by the red lines. As you can see, in every single case, there's a higher rate of employment of men than women in every one of these countries in Europe. The effective engagement of women in governance in the US, they're underrepresented in leadership, unrepresented in parliaments. Globally, politically, in the year 2017, only 23.4% of women in national parliaments, as opposed to more than two-thirds being men. 39% of countries worldwide have used some form of quota system to increase women's representation in politics, but it's not enough. Management, as was pointed out with respect to law firms and so on by Oyango, less than 1/3 of senior and middle management positions are held by women. And
Aaron,
interestingly, yes.
I just want to jump in because I'm getting some feedback that some folks are struggling to see the great infographic here. Do you want to click in the lower right-hand corner of your screen, the little icon that looks like a projector, a little bit to the left? Net to the left of the sliding scale. Yeah, oh, you just hovered over it for a second.
Where?
A little bit farther left, one more. Yeah, that one to start your show. And then I think it'll blow it up a bit. Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Sorry for interrupting.
No, thank you. I'm glad for the interruption. Okay, so I'll go back to the previous slide, which for some reason I can't see. I can't see the title of it. Yeah, but now here's the previous slide. This was the employment levels between men and women in various countries in Europe, in all the countries in Europe. As you can see, men far outnumber women in the workforce. And then in this particular slide, it shows that while quotas have been implemented to boost women's participation in politics and corporate boards, parity is far from reality. Lower right-hand square in this slide says 47% of world business leaders say they're in favor of gender quotas on corporate boards. Yet women on corporate boards is a real exception everywhere in the world. The Beijing Platform for Action had described this is from the Beijing presentation, gender balance, politics, power, and decision-making. We've made very glacial progress since then, but take a look at this slide, gender diversity in government. And as you watch the dates progress, you see how many countries have increased their percentage of female leadership. So by 1950, in the 50s, very gradual. And as you can see, it continued to go forward. But it's still they've had a female leader. But if you look at the female leaders today, there's another slide, you'll see that there are only 3 countries that have a female president. Women in the legislature, there are only 3 countries that have a majority of women in their legislature, Cuba, Bolivia, and Rwanda. And this is effective as of January 1st, 2019, and include 192 countries. In the judiciary, there are fewer and fewer members of the judiciary that are women. In judicial systems globally, you can see by this chart, and I can't move the slide because I have the pictures of the speakers on here. But is the picture of the speaker covering the right side of this presentation on the right side of my screen?
No.
So you can see the percentages, 10%, 20%, 30%, but it doesn't get much better than 30%, and that's in Latin America and Central and Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Here it shows the working age population in the workforce. Men number 76.1%, women less than half. And according to the chart and according to the studies, global annual GDP will be boosted by US $28 trillion if women played an identical role to men in the labor markets. And as you can see on the right-hand side, it shows women in the global workforce and how that's divided up. It's still woefully inadequate. These are the principles from UN Women. And these are the principles that have been enunciated to establish high-level corporate leadership for gender equality, to treat all women and men fairly at work, respect and support human rights and non-discrimination, ensure health, safety, and well-being of all women and men workers, et cetera, et cetera. It's not happening, and without the help of men, it's not going to happen either. So we see a phenomenon where corruption is worse in countries. The higher the corruption, the lower the standard of the rule of law, and the less participation there is by women. And if you look at C-suite positions, it says that women are underrepresented at every level. And at the top levels, they're the most underrepresented. And so my slide here is that men's help is needed to achieve parity. And the summary is that you can't have a rule of law where there's discrimination against women. Where women are not treated as full equals to men, global economic development and wealth is significantly affected negatively. Here's the statistic concerning anti-corruption. Shows that the cumulative long-run effect of corruption on growth is a decrease in real per capita GDP of about 17%. And this is a recent research paper that generated this data. And so the more women in power, according to other studies, the less corrupt the country. So these are all various statistics, but because a lot of these points were made by some of the preceding speakers, I thought it might be interesting to try and just emphasize that and leave more time for discussion at this point, at this stage. Are there any of these slides that you wanted to see again?
I think that you zoomed in right when we got to the infographics. So I think that we're all set.
Okay, well then I rest my case. Yeah, I really do think we're all on the same page. We all have the same perspective, and that really what needs to be done is men have to be involved, not just told about this, but they have to be engaged, and we have to do what we can to engage other men. So I guess Oyango and I have our work cut out for us.
Well, with that, Aaron, I'd like to invite everyone to turn on their cameras again, and thank you so much for your remarks. I think we're going to bring it together for a brief roundtable discussion with the time that we have left. So a common thread here is disparate treatment versus impact. And I'd like to bring everyone back so we can tease out the different ways each of the topics we've been discussing impact women at different socioeconomic levels. So I think, Aaron, you'll have to stop sharing your screen potentially.
Yeah, I'm trying to do that.
Okay, let's see. Oh, thank you. Great. So the first thing I want to touch on is something that Pauline raised. You know, we know that different cultural norms, such as gender roles, can contribute to women having less socioeconomic power than men, especially where those roles are deeply entrenched in the social and legal systems of particular communities. Pauline, you raised some of the disruptive effects of climate change on existing social and legal systems. And I'd like to hear from you and Oyango on how you think climate change and other large-scale disruptions, such as the pandemic or conflict, might deepen existing gender inequities, or in contrast, actually break down some of the cultural norms tying women to certain roles that hinder their economic development.
Well, thanks, Jessica. I think firstly, the multiple factors that go to creating inequality can be exacerbated by crisis. And we've seen that occur, and that's why women are unequally affected by climate change. We've also seen, certainly in Australia, the COVID-19 pandemic has affected women and their children living in poverty much more dramatically than other people in society. So the impacts definitely are there. But I do think you're right that there are opportunities in times of crisis that can help to address inequalities, because people are forced to adapt in times of crisis. So conversely, there can be, it can make the conversation easier about addressing inequality, because politically that can sometimes be a very tricky conversation to have, and politicians are often wary of promoting equality for fear of adverse impacts. But when there's a real crisis, when the community can see the impact on different parts of society in times of crisis, they're less likely to be critical of their political leaders for taking action on those things. That's the way that I see it. Oyango, I guess you have a different view, or you might have a similar view. I'm not sure.
No, I have similar views. You know, one of the things that I pride myself on is not being an ally, right? I'm an anti-ally. I would rather be a co-conspirator. An ally only advocates, right? It empathizes, it understands, but a co-conspirator actually takes action. You know, based on my upbringing, I was always taught to take action for the causes that you actually believe in. And I actually agree with everything you stated. You know, women are mostly impacted by climate change to a greater degree. It goes to the statistics that you and I talked about, Pauline, right? You think about women being heads of households, rather married or unmarried. There are children, there are other caretaking responsibilities. There are decisions that need to be made about power sources, electrification. There are decisions that need to be made about recycling and policies that impact local communities. And women are at the forefront of making these decisions. And there's this group called One Earth that I was reading their materials. They laid out, like, I think it was 6 or 8 different principles or as to why on how climate change impacts women. And you know, there were a few of them that were just eye-opening, but not really. They were pretty much obvious. Women are better leaders in times of crisis. I mean, just look back and check the history. You know, I know that for a long time here in America, there was always this you know, this scant in at the local level as to whether or not, if a woman became president, what that would mean for war. Well, we've been at nothing but wars ever since the beginning of time in America, and no woman has ever been president. So maybe if we, what's that saying? If you stop doing the same thing, you might get a different result. maybe we should consider that. On a more serious note, you know, from being displaced, during these times of crisis and disruption, you have an increase in sexual violence. You have an increase in health disparities. You have a decrease in economic power and economic positioning, because those resources get tied up in having to respond to various crises and different things that are related to climate. Think back of all the crises that you saw or that we've learned about. there has always been, I'm thinking about the Flint, Michigan water crisis. I'm thinking about several of the oil spills that we've seen. There has always been women at the forefront of leading in times of crises. They're also arguably better organizers. Look what happened in Georgia with Stacey Abrams in the United States. Speaker Pelosi had been Speaker in the United States Congress for a reason. And there are a number of other labor organizers and components to this piece. I would conclude by saying, Jessica and Pauline, that I think there's significant opportunities for women to leverage and exercise their voice at a greater degree in order to really impact the climate change policies that are at our local levels, as well as our national levels and international levels for that matter. It was a group of women that actually had the most impact on the Paris Accord, which we don't really talk about and know about. I believe they were called the Lionesses. They actually came up with the concept of net zero. So there's just so much history as it relates to climate change and how we can move the ball forward on this particular topic, and how women are at the forefront, but also women are at the back of it as well. And the back of it meaning those that are bearing the brunt of it and really trying to push us forward. So that's my take on it. And I hope to continue to be the best co-conspirator I possibly can be in this regard. And so Aaron, I'm with you 100%. We do have our work cut out for us.
No, I appreciate those comments from you both. And you reference Aaron, and we've also talked about the greater likelihood that women encounter corruption. Aaron raised this issue, given higher rates of access to public services and often greater dependency on government programs. Of course, women are not necessarily less corrupt than men, although we may be inclined to assume so. But the absence of women from positions of leadership in government and business exacerbates the forces that allow corruption to proliferate. So I'd like to ask Harumi and Aaron to comment on how women's economic empowerment helps strengthen good governance overall and potentially mitigate some of these collateral consequences of corruption, like limited access to resources and public services and generally civic institutions.
Aaron, would you like to go forward?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. I mean, we talked about the impact of corruption on the rule of law and on society, particularly on women, because as we've already pointed out, they're already suffering more from being in the lower segment of society, in the lower earning segment, the lower performance segments of society tend to be the most oppressed economically in an environment where corruption thrives. And the converse is true, of course, in those countries, and many of them Scandinavian countries, which have had much higher involvement of women in society and in economics, business, the amount of corruption is less. Yes, I agree with what you said, Jessica, that women are not necessarily less corrupt than men, but corruption, no matter who's behind it, is harming women more than it's harming men, just because of the relative, the disproportionate positions that they tend to have in the various societies where corruption is rife. And where corruption is rampant, there's much more of an emphasis on hurting the people who are at most risk. And in that case, where there's been corruption, is like a double. I had some statistics which showed that where the corruption rate is at 60%, there's something like one half as many people who are able to benefit economically as in societies where the corruption level is is double that. So it's an inverse proportion. The more corruption, the more it affects more women. Less corruption, the less it affects more women. And conversely, the higher the income stream at both ends. So less corruption, higher income, higher women achievement, more corruption, lower income, and less achievement by women.
Yes, and I do agree with everything that Aaron has said, and as well as what Pauline and Oyango have said thus far, as well as the points that Jessica, you're bringing to us to discuss. The involvement of women, I think, is very important and critical, not only because we exist in this society and we live in this world. It's very important for the women to be heard in bringing to bear different historical experiences that the women have experienced over the years, as well as different experiences that we have today that may not be necessarily felt by men. I believe sometimes the women's experiences are so uniquely felt by women that unless we voice our experiences and our value systems and our opinions and our input, it would not be a very fair reflection of the entire population, wherever we are. But to do that, though, I believe it's very important to create an environment of participation and empowerment. Having women present and be named in certain categories or boards or organizations is not enough. We need to have an environment where women are heard, feel very empowered to be a part of the process, and to be embellished and accepted and acknowledged for the opinions and voices that we give. And I know that we have also discussed in this presentation the need for the men to be supportive of women and to involve us. Equally important, I believe, is the role that we women play ourselves in being there to support, to promote, and to advance women. I believe that when we have certain positions where we can be heard, we would need to really speak for and on behalf of other women, and to create an environment of welcome to bring in other women. We need to be inclusive ourselves, and we need to be there to really support and help others who may not be in as sort of a fortunate situation in serving in more of a public arena. And so I think overall, it's important, as others have said, to have women because we do cover a very large part of the percentage of the society, but to create the environment and of support and empowerment would be extremely important for all of us.
Yeah, I appreciate everyone's comments regarding kind of, the conceptual elements that go into women's economic empowerment. But I also think it's important to talk about, the financial, the kind of hard currency side of things as well, right? So according to the World Bank, more than 1 billion women still lack access to major financial systems, while in many parts of the world, women are formally and informally prevented from accessing financial services. Evidence shows that women are stronger savers than men, and improving their access to finance could unlock hundreds of billions of dollars in global revenue, which in turn is an important piece in upholding rule of law, strong economies. So I'd like to ask the panel as a whole, what do you see as the largest impediment to women's access to financial services and cultivation of assets in your respective communities?
I'll just give all I will say is that for me and from what I've seen around the world, it's a cultural issue. The big impediment is the culture of male dominance and chauvinism that exists, that really, whether it's overt or not, it exists, it's there, it's intrinsic, it's a form of discrimination that really should not be accepted, should not be tolerated. But that's the real impediment. It's the existing subculture, if you will, where women are viewed either as objects or as some kind of inferior beings, or as someone that has a specifically identified role in certain types of societies, mother, slave worker, whatever you want to call it, but not viewed as someone on a professional egalitarian plane with men. So that's my take on it.
Jessica, I agree absolutely with Aaron. I mean, it wasn't until the 1970s in Australia that women could, in fact, obtain a bank loan at all without the permission or support of their husband or father. So we're still suffering that, across the globe in different countries, that is still the case. Women are not able to even borrow money. So how can they contribute economically to the community where they can't even establish a small business for themselves by borrowing some money to establish that business? So that kind of empowerment of women, just enabling women to be able to have access to finance, whereas you say they've shown themselves to be good savers, better savers than men in general. There's no reason that anymore that women should be denied access to finance.
And also, I believe, go ahead.
I would just add that to supplement both Pauline and Aaron, I am a testament that my wife is the better saver in our household. But the reality of the situation is it really hinges on many different things. There's no one thing. I think, Jessica, there's the chauvinistic components that Aaron talked about. There's the discrimination, the restrictions on freedoms of women's freedoms and rights. There's the limitations on property and inherent inheritance rights. There is that lack of access to financial resources or financial services because of all of these different components, whether it's discriminatory or whether it's actually legally permissible in some countries and even in some states here in the United States, not just in developing countries, but in developed countries and in developed states that actually, if the laws are not on the books, there are the unwritten policies at which women have to jump through hoops. And I can relate to this being a person of color because this is where some similarities actually happen when you're talking about access to capital and financial services to start a business or to buy a home or to buy a car or to fund education for your little ones. The insufficient legal protections for women coupled with the discriminatory behavior and the actual laws that are on the books that prohibit those types of freedoms and mobility from being able to lead in a way that they're capable of doing are some of the burdens and impediments to women gaining access to economic power. I talked about economic power in my segment. I talked about the ability to where you have many women who are leading households, they have the need to make the key decisions that not only impact themselves, but impact families and generations and others that they care for. So it goes beyond just the woman's personhood herself. It's also the people that she cares for and the lack of opportunity that they are actually being stripped of because of the lack of economic means based off these discriminatory practices or unwritten or actually written policies that's on the books that prohibits them from getting the type of access that the question embeds.
And if I may add to everything that everybody has said thus far, what's I believe also important is the education starting at a younger age to be given the opportunity to manage money and to think about investments. I know that in some parts of the world, even receiving education by women is a very, very difficult reality to achieve. And so education is important. And what's interesting to me, just by way of an example, in Japan, in many of the households, it's the women, it's the wives that control the family budget. They're sort of empowered, or they're expected to take care of all things household, because a lot of the women actually do not work after they get married, or especially after they start raising children. And so a lot of the women tend to be at home rather than being in the workforce. And because of that, I think over the history of times, the women were expected to take care of all things homebound, including the finances. And so that's sort of an expected or permitted role of women in many of the households in Japan. And because of that, the banks, the vendors, sort of the financial or service providers, including insurance companies, they tend to actually approach the wives to purchase products and to make investments and to buy things for the household. And so even though in a country like Japan, where there are women politicians, and one of the key aspects of the promotional goals of the Japanese government is to advance women and to involve more women in all various sectors in the Japanese community and the political scene and the business scene. But on the family home side, it's very much expected and normal for the women to take care of these finances. So that to me is very interesting, that if you have a permissive and expectation of what women are supposed to do, women do rise to the occasion, and women do in fact do it.
I think Japan's an exception to the rule, though, in all due respect. I think California is an exception to the rule, and we have three of you on the panel from California, because California has, so many examples of women leading, and yet it's still not enough in reality, even though, and California is way ahead of the pack, and parts of the United States are so far behind the eight ball, it's not even funny.
Yeah, Jessica, when I kind of analyze what everybody said, there's legal, structural, and cultural barriers to economic progress and participation for women, whether it's policies that are actual laws on the books or unwritten policies, whether it's cultural issues, educational issues that Harumi mentioned, or structural issues that women have to face in trying to access capital and access finances. So I wanted to just summarize that, because as everybody was speaking, we all kind of touched on one of those elements, whether it was legal, cultural, or structural. And it's just interesting that we came to that conclusion.
I would say the legal and structural really follow the culture, though.
Yes, indeed, Aaron.
Yeah, and I think there are also, Harumi mentioned kind of an unexpected way in which women are permitted to participate in financial services and decision making. And I think there are also unexpected ways too that women are prevented from accessing those areas of the economy. And we've talked about the indirect regulation of women's economic status through mechanisms such as discriminatory employment practices or laws that openly limit access to financial services. But I'd like to kind of turn the discussion to the direct regulation of women's bodies and health and the economic impact of those regulations. As some of us know, much focus in recent weeks in the United States has been on the future of laws ensuring access to reproductive health services. So, can you speak about the connection between women's health care and economic participation and civil liberties?
I'll kick us off, and then I'd love I would love in this instance, this is one of those situations where I would like the woman to have the last word, right? Considering the question and the topic. In bifurcating whatever your politics is on abortion, to abort or not abort, or to your right to lifers, and those who believe in women's choice. The fact of the matter is that we have laws in this country now, and potentially the supreme law of the land, that will make a decision that affects only 51% of the population that happens to be female. So in and of itself, the principles of which we talk about, the rule of law being applied fairly to all, no matter of race, religion, color, sex, national origin, you name it, will only be derivative to, or applied rather, to women in our country as far as what they can and cannot do. That confuses me based off the constitutional principles of which we learned growing up. And in looking at the equitable principles of the rule of law and the process at which civil liberties are supposed to be aligned with the privilege, the rights and freedoms that one has to exercise over their personhood, over their individual personhood. I also say this, is that we have stripped in America, we have tried to strip out the religious practices from our Constitution. But yet the very religious practice of those who support or who are anti-abortionists is based on religious and principle grounds, which technically has no bearing in the Constitution. We were supposed to get rid of and separate church and state from our constitutional findings. So I find a significant amount of hypocrisy in our own constitutional principles in application as to how we are to govern ourselves as a developed country, what an individual has the civil liberty to do in order to make a choice on their individual bodies. So from that perspective, I hope, and I know that there are some that say, well, this will just be the Supreme Court and states can do what they want. The other side of this, and I'll conclude here and allow others to jump in here, is that we're taught that we're supposed to rely on precedents, established rule of law, established case law, in order to make key decisions. Now, that's not to say that something shouldn't be overturned if it is malicious, if it is have an unjust bearing on legal principles or on persons. I don't think that this was one of those. I think this was more politically baked than an actual principle that had some type of malicious bearing on society in some way. So with that being said, my thought process is that as an individual of the bar and someone who studied legal principles and practiced legal principles, or the application of law rather, for over 15 years, I find ourselves at a moment of hypocrisy in our country based off everything that we've learned as far as constitutional freedoms and the individual rights that we are supposed to have in this country.
Perhaps I can jump in and talk about the situation in Australia. Across Australia, terminating a pregnancy is lawful in every state and territory. There are some controls over it, but essentially you can access a pregnancy termination if you need one throughout Australia. And that is in recognition, I think, here of the right to bodily integrity, the right to determine what happens to your own body, and it grew from that. In fact, I think Australia was one of the first places in the world to, I think South Australia brought in the first laws that enabled pregnancy termination by women upon request. Reproductive health laws are dangerous to women's ability to govern their own lives and to self-determination. If you tell a woman that she must proceed with a pregnancy, that will affect her whole life. It may be that she's become pregnant because of an unlawful act, such as a rape. She may have very good reasons for not wishing to proceed with that pregnancy. It may not be as dramatic as a rape, but nevertheless, I think that the laws in Australia have developed to respect that right of women to determination of their bodies, what happens to their bodies and their lives, in recognition that having a child is a tremendous responsibility and something that should only be entered into by people who are willing and able to proceed in their lives confidently down the path of bringing up a child, which is one of the most important things you can do. Thanks.
Coming back to the United States side with respect to the topic at issue, I think many of us are concerned by the leak of the sort of the proposed draft of the Supreme Court decision to be made, because it really deferred. I mean, it presented a lot of questions and issues, including with respect to the role of the Supreme Court, the impact that different justices could have and bring to bear. So aside from all this, when we're talking about the women's right to healthcare and the women's right to make decisions for herself, that is really, to me, a very fundamental, important issue for the women and for the people of this country. And to be told that you have access to certain types of healthcare depending upon where you live or where you don't live, because I believe what's been proposed is let's have each state of the United States decide what is appropriate for each state. There are impediments to some of the larger states, people to be able to move to another state or to go to another state. That becomes a financial issue and a financial burden. To have equality in access to healthcare and to be able to make decisions for your own body and to have that taken away from you and to somehow or another be determined by the legislative body, the politicians of a particular state, to me just seems we're going back in time of what we have been able to achieve since the ruling was made in Roe v. Wade. And so while, as Oyango mentioned, it is appropriate to overrule certain decisions that have been rendered by the Supreme Court of this nation. But it seems to me that in the past, those were done in order to enhance and create greater civil rights for people. This time, I think to many of us, it feels very different. It feels very constrictive, and it's changing the landscape of how we in this country can be and can expect, especially by way of healthcare and the ability to make decisions and the possible impact of this particular ruling, if that is the direction that the Supreme Court takes, on the rights of others, other minorities, LGBTQ people, the different segments of the society where the law should be extended to protect them and to nurture them and to advance them. It's very uncertain now. And so I think a lot of us are going to be very eagerly watching where we're going to be with this, but it's a very, very, very important decision and important role that the Supreme Court justices are taking.
Thank you so much, Harumi. I just want to ask, well, we have just a few minutes here. One final question, and I'll pose it to you, Erin, if you are inclined, since I kind of cut you off before you had an opportunity to answer the last question. I'd like to know, we were talking about impediments and barriers, and I'd like to think about reforms and opportunities for improving the economic security of women. And I'm curious what differences you see between governments and non-governmental organizations' abilities to eliminate the legal and social barriers that inhibit women's economic participation and independence.
Well, if the government's not going to do it, and you can't rely on the government, because the last conversation just showed why that's an issue. I think, to a large extent, we do have to depend on NGOs. We do have to depend on splinter groups, and I think that's a reality. Unfortunately, the United Nations doesn't have the power that many of us think it should have. And in enlightened societies, intelligence rules. And so, I mean, there's no question where I stand on the last question. I stand with the women on this panel completely. And we're all on the same side there. But I think if you can't depend on government to do it, you're going to have to find a voice of NGOs, non-governmental organizations, people to band together to propose new legislation, to demonstrate where need be, to go out and march in the streets. It takes what it takes, and we're not there yet. We're not there in the race area. We're not there in the gender area, and we're not there in the economic area. So we've got to keep fighting. All of us have to keep fighting.
We have one more minute in case I invite anyone else who has any thoughts on that. Otherwise, I'm happy to close out our session. Well, go ahead, Pauline.
No, I was just going to say thank you. I agree with Aaron. I think grassroots NGO organizations can be really effective, as can international NGOs like the UN. But similarly, legal professional organizations like ours can be really powerful advocacy bodies.
And also on the individual basis too, we each can do so much. And we just cannot forget the fact that we need to be proactive, we need to be participatory, we need to be actively involved in what we can do for one another and for ourselves.
Great. Well, I certainly agree with that. And I'd just like to say thank you so much to all of our panelists, Aaron, Oyango, Harumi, and Pauline, for participating today and for your remarks. And thank you for everyone watching for joining us for this panel. Our unprecedented 24-hour webathon does not stop here. At the top of the hour, we'll join the Japan Federation of Bar Associations for a panel discussing forced labor and current challenges to sustainable development. So please stick around for that. I'm happy to vamp for the next few minutes until our panel ends. And I'd love to hear, just thinking about a few more questions now that we're officially wrapped up. We're talking about taking steps individually, and Oyango and Harumi, you in particular, both advocate on behalf of lawyers across California, including women. And although it's half of the state's population, women make up less than 50% of California's attorneys, and women of color comprise an even smaller portion. So I'd be curious, if you have comments in the last minute, how you talk about this underrepresentation issue in your prospective bar associations, and also when you're talking with other organizations.
Very quickly. So there's two different segments. There's the current existing profession. You can't just pluck people off the street, right? So I look at that as equitable and inclusivity. How do we make the current profession more equitable, or provide equitable opportunities for women and people of color, as well as inclusive? But the work really is on pathways. You have more women graduating from law school now, or at least over the past few years, but they're not sticking to the profession. So it's about getting a message out that we need them to be part of the solution in order to help alleviate some of the concerns. But we also need to pull male advocates and others to help do that. You can't put the burden on those who are the historically marginalized group to solve the crisis. You have to bring people together in order to help do it.
Yeah, the money's held mostly controlled by the male counterparts, And in order to get more people in the profession, you got to pay women the same amount of money they pay men. And so that's to start with people who have control of the purse. Maybe they need to hire people from Japan to do that.
And then in California, we have different bar associations in addition to the California Lawyers Association that have existed over a very, very long time, including the Women Lawyers Association of Los Angeles, known as ULALA, Asian Pacific American Women Lawyers Alliance, known as APALA. There's the Black Women Lawyers Association of Los Angeles. And so there are different associations that are available. And I think we need to make these associations available and known to people, and to have both men and women be involved in these associations that have different missions. But the end goal is we're all wanting to be inclusive. We're all wanting to create a better community in our society.
Well, I think you did just that, and increasing the visibility of those organizations by shouting them out here. So I really appreciate that, and I thank you again for all of your comments and for your engagement today. It's been great, and I think that is it. I'll turn it over to admin and to the next panel.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody. Nice to meet you.
Nice meeting you all too. Thank you.
Thanks, Aaron. Thanks, Harumi. Thanks, Oyango. Thanks, Jessica.
Thank you to all of you.
Bye.